Hello and welcome to Independent Thinking, the weekly podcast from Chatham House. I'm Bronwen Maddox. This week, we're talking about one of the most contested regions on Earth, the South China Sea. A vast maritime space home to hundreds of reefs, barely inhabitable islands, and yet, since the beginning of civilization, one of the great maritime crossroads. At the moment, almost $3.5 trillion worth of trade goes through this sea every year, and it has become a hotbed of competing claims from Malaysia, the Philippines, Brunei, Vietnam, Taiwan, and of course China. In recent months, days even, tensions have spiked. The focus is Second Thomas Shoal. Its western name, China and the Philippines each have their names for it. The reef is presently held by the Philippines Armed Forces, but claimed by China, and attempts to resupply Filipino Marines stationed on the shoal have been repeatedly blocked by China, either with coastguard cutters, ramming Filipino Navy vessels, or the use of powerful hoses. Last week saw dramatic images of some of the Chinese Coast Guard wielding axes and knives against Filipino Navy personnel, pictures reminiscent of those seen on the India-China border in the Himalayas 4 years ago. And now China has conducted drills near the island to show its strength. So we are going to talk about these tensions in the South China Sea, whether they are going to boil over, whether it could be the next major flashpoint. Could it be this tiny shoal that brings US-China tensions to a head, thanks to the American-Filipino Mutual Defense Treaty? Well, I've got a brilliant panel with me. Joining me down the line from Singapore is Dr. Collin Koh, Senior Fellow at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me here.
Collin, it's great to have you. Little closer to home is Dr. Olivia Cheung, a research fellow of the China Institute at SOAS, University of London, and the author of a recent book on Xi Jinping. Welcome.
Delighted to be here.
Delighted to have you. And finally with us is Bill Hayton, an associate fellow with our Asia Pacific program and author of the book The South China Sea. I can't think of a better one for this particular topic. Welcome, Bill.
Great, thank you for having me.
Really, really good to, I'm going to say, see you all, but you're all remote and I'm here in Chatham House. So let's just set the scene around this tiny reef that is the site of so much tension. Bill, can you explain what is Second Thomas Shoal and why does it matter to both China and the Philippines?
Well, it is, as you say, a tiny coral reef. It's the kind of place that in a different set of circumstances, it would be a lovely place to go scuba diving, go and see the tropical fish and everything. But it's also one of the most hotly disputed features in the South China Sea. I was going to say territorial features, but actually it isn't even territory because at high tide, there's nothing to see. It's underwater. Only at low tide do a few rocks pop out. And in May 1999, in an effort to prove that they owned and controlled it, the Philippines rammed what was a former American transport ship onto the reef. And there it has sat ever since, and it's been slowly rusting away. And China, I think, has been hoping that it would rust into such bad condition that the Philippines forces would have to leave. But the Philippines have always maintained a tiny garrison, 5 or 6 Marines, living on this sort of windswept, storm-lashed coral reef.
On a wrecked ship, as you're saying. Yeah. Wrecked, rusting ship, trying to patch it up to stop this claim falling away.
And so the Philippines has been trying to shore up, literally, its position there. And whilst China was sort of prepared, I think, to tolerate the delivery of things like food and water to these men on this boat, they have definitely tried to stop anything that could be used to repair the ship being there. So I think they thought they were just going to play a long game. The ship would fall away, and then maybe they would be able to claim the reef if the Philippines left. But it's all come to a head in the last certainly in the last few days. But this has been building for weeks and months.
And even possibly longer than that. Before we sat down in the studio for this discussion, we were able to talk to Commodore Jay Tarriela of the Philippine Coast Guard about what happened at Second Thomas Shoal last week.
The Chinese Coast Guard have deployed more than 6 China Coast Guard vessels, and they didn't stop from harassing the Philippine Navy regional inflatable boats. They were carrying axes, knives, and bolos, attacking the regional inflatable boats, trying to destroy the entire boats. And that incident of doing that kind of harassment even led to a collision wherein Chinese Coast Guard small boat rammed directly at a high speed the Philippine Navy reef that resulted to an injury of one Navy SEALs losing his finger because of that incident. And this all happened around 6 a.m. in the morning. So when it was reported to the Philippine Coast Guard that they're already having this kind of harassment from the Chinese Coast Guard and there was already an injury, we deployed our small boats, but we were also placed again in dangerous maneuver and total blocking of the Chinese Coast Guard vessels. In short, the Philippine Navy failed to do their supply mission. During this time, the Armed Forces of the Philippines declared to abort the mission. And then we eventually learned that the boats of the Philippine Navy were not just ransacked, but the Chinese Coast Guard personnel even used hammers to destroy the navigation equipment, to damage the outboard motor, which disabled these reefs to go out of Ayungin Shoal, which is the reason why the Chinese Coast Guard small boats were the one that towed these two reefs outside of Ayungin Shoal. And while they were being towed, the five injured Philippine Navy personnel, especially the one that has an injured finger, was brought to BRP Sierra Madre.
And the Commodore also set out how the Philippines intends to respond, or in fact, not to respond by escalating this.
So, the President Bongbong Marcos has already delivered a speech last Sunday. The first thing that we would really like to highlight is that their supply operation is just a routine, ordinary humanitarian mission carried out by the Armed Forces of the Philippines. And there is no reason for any external actors to prevent us from doing that. So, as far as the national government is concerned, we are still going to continue the resupply operations, regardless the danger and the harassment of the Chinese government is doing. Second, we don't think that the United States has to intervene in supporting our supply mission. We still believe on the capability of the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine Coast Guard to carry out this supply operation successfully on our own. But I think it's also worth mentioning that President Bongbong Marcos has highlighted that we are a country that is not something that would instigate war. We're not here to provoke anybody. We're not here to escalate the tension. The Philippine government and President Bongbong Marcos has been very clear. We are still committed to peace, prosperity, and regional stability of this part of the world. Despite of the aggressive action of China, we are still a believer of settlement of peaceful dispute of this dispute here in with China.
Collin, let me ask you, what is your reaction to what the Commodore was saying? What has been the regional response to this incident?
So just to, of course, lay out what Bill had pointed out earlier, the second Thomas Shore is a low tide elevation. It is located well within the Philippine exclusive economic zone. And so therefore, the Philippines enjoy what, according to the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea, sovereign rights to its EEZ. And of course, the associated activities such as resupplying the Sierra Madre outpost falls within those rights.
So in your view, in international law, there should be no argument. This should belong to the Philippines.
So this is sometimes a point that is often missed out amongst what we tend to see, a sort of layman discussion about this issue is there's a clear difference between sovereignty and sovereign rights.
Yes, good point.
So in this case, if we go by, strictly speaking, international law and what those provisions have set out for, the Philippines, of course, does not enjoy sovereignty per se in its EEZ. But what we are looking at is sovereign rights. And part of the convention that talks about this EEZ provision is, of course, the ability of the concerned coastal state, in this case, the Philippines, to build and maintain artificial islands, for example. China has no right, of course, to stop the Philippines, hypothetically speaking, if the Philippines decides, to replace Sierra Madre or to reinforce Sierra Madre, assuming that Sierra Madre is in a way, an artificial island, if you want to use that label.
Just to be clear, this is the name of the Philippine vessel that is now stuck on this shoal.
Yes. So based on what Commodore Tarriela has said, clearly this is the exercise or the legitimate exercise of the Philippine sovereign rights. And at the same time, you recall the 2016 arbitral award that was handed down. The Chinese basis of its claims to the South China Sea, mainly the use of the so-called 9 or 10-dash line, had been invalidated. So therefore, it in a way invalidated China's claim to that particular stretch of waters. So because of that, if you go by the award itself, China's continued exercising of its moves to undermine the Philippines over Sierra Madre is deemed as illegitimate or illegal in that sense. So now you ask the question regarding the regional response to the last week's incident. If we talk about regional response, and mainly we're talking about the broader Asia or Indo-Pacific.
Yes, I'm not talking about China.
We are in fact just looking at a handful of regional countries that actually made open public statements with respect to what happened. From Japan and from South Korea, we have seen official statements that express concern and laid out in very explicit terms what they view as very concerning moves by China. So in a way, Japan and South Korea explicitly call out China for that. However, if you look at the broader region itself, what we have here are largely silence. If we talk about the Philippines' immediate neighbors and of course, fellow member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, practically, other than Vietnam, that has made some very generic statement that doesn't, in a way, call out China, the rest of ASEAN, they did not make any statement and any, word about this particular incident, which is in the way characteristic of what they're doing.
Largely silence, as you say. So we will explore this point in a minute. Olivia, take us into what China is trying to do.
I think the starting point here is that China's leader, Xi Jinping, does place a special significance on the South China Sea. Back in 2013, Xi Jinping's first ever foreign policy meeting, a large-scale one, soon after he came to power, was precisely on the conflicts surrounding South China Sea. And at that meeting in 2013, he said, the principle, in China managing its neighboring relationship is really to ensure that neighboring countries can benefit from China's economic growth. And at the same time, China should defend its sovereignty. Now, in the years since, what we have seen is that the defense of Chinese sovereignty seems to have taken priority. I think a main reason surrounding this is really a change in China's foreign policy guideline under Xi Jinping, where an assertive and even aggressive defense of Chinese sovereign claims are seen to be highly important and must be rigorously pursued.
Bill, where do you think this is going to go?
Well, I think it's all up to China, really, at this point. And there's a kind of bigger game, I think, going on here, which is that the Philippines is a treaty ally of the United States. And so, in theory, any incident, any attack on a Philippine Navy vessel or Coast Guard vessel, as we've seen, could, in theory, be grounds to invoke the Mutual Defense Treaty and actually bring the Americans and China into a confrontation. Obviously, nobody wants that to happen.
And would you include in that China? That is not what China wants. It is not what China is trying to do.
No, I think what it would like to do is to punish the Philippines for getting too close to the United States, and in particular to open or bring in the question of Taiwan. So the US has obviously been taking steps in recent years to try to reinforce its position near and around Taiwan, I think to sort of face down Chinese intimidation there, and has had an agreement with the Philippines to what's called the EDCA agreement, Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, to put more supplies in certain bases in the Philippines, which has been read as a means of trying to increase the American footprint, if you like, in the region. And I think China, by choosing this confrontation, I think is hoping that it can put sufficient pressure on the Philippines that it can get some kind of concessions, maybe, to reduce American access to bases or something like that, increase the costs on the Philippines. So it may well be that these confrontations, although they are important in themselves, and as Olivia was saying, territory is at the heart of what Xi Jinping calls his national rejuvenation of the Chinese nation project. There may also be another game going on around it.
And just so I've understood you, the other game being control of this whole maritime region, or the other game being Taiwan, which has, for all of these islands have a significance to China, that one obviously has a particular resonance.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I think Taiwan, I think, is the number one territorial objective. But obviously, if you can fracture the American alliance system in the Indo-Pacific and put a sort of significant gap between the US and the Philippines, then that would obviously be a bonus from Beijing's point of view.
It's a really interesting point that you've made. I'm struck by what the Commodore said in that clip, which is that the Philippines doesn't want to escalate this crisis. It doesn't need US military support right now, but does want to keep its resupply missions. So trying to keep things low key, not escalated. But in doing that, you might say, showing China that it can drive a little bit of a wedge between the Philippines and the US.
Yes, and interestingly, to begin with, the Philippines was quite careful to use a civilian ship to do these resupply missions, thereby, not creating grounds for the treaty to be invoked. But obviously now it's starting to involve coastguards. Then, the escalation ladder has already started getting higher. So, yeah, I think nobody wants to see it, but we're such, it is bizarre that this coral reef, which you can't even see at high tide, could become such a test of will between China on one side and the Philippines / the US behind them on the other side, that nobody wants to be seen to be backing down. And you could end up with quite a bad confrontation over otherwise insignificant feature.
Olivia, do you agree with this picture? Because, the world has been looking at the tension around Taiwan for a very long time, and China's rhetoric around that obviously getting steadily tougher. And then the Taiwanese newly elected president responding with what to some people was unexpectedly tough language back in May on his inauguration. So everyone looking at Taiwan and suddenly the tension building up here. Does it all feel like part of the same picture to you, the same plan for China?
Yeah, it really does, actually. I think, when you look at the South China Sea, it is important to put it in the wider context of, China's ambition in the Asia-Pacific or Indo-Pacific region, of which Taiwan is the crown jewel or the ultimate prize. And obviously, the South China Sea claims, with the various islands and shores, China wants to exercise effective control. But really to do that, what China really needs to do is to push the United States out of the Western Pacific. Now, the complication here in the case of the Philippines, as we have addressed already, is that it is a treaty ally of the US. And hence, the US angle very much features, in the current conflict that we see. Perhaps if I might bring in some of the domestic, Chinese narratives on how this has been discussed. And what really struck me is just how much, this has been about the United States. If you look at, Chinese media and social media discourse. So one of the, angles that have been used to narrate what is happening is that the US and Philippines have a mutual defense treaty. Hence, this is potentially a very serious issue. However, it is also noticed by, Chinese commentators that the United States hasn't done much at all. It has verbally supported the Philippines, but haven't actually backed up what it said with actions. Furthermore, it has also been emphasized in Chinese commentaries that, various Western countries, Japan and South Korea, they have condemned China, but they haven't done much either. And the bigger picture that they put this in is that there is what they call Western double standard. And that claim is resting on the premise that the second Thomas Shaw is in a region that China has control of, that China has sovereignty of. Hence, the Philippines are actually infringing Chinese territory to begin with.
China is getting very fluent, as are other countries, about this charge of double standards, which we've done a great deal on at Chatham House. And certainly you can see the West is guilty of that sometimes, but so are other countries, China included. Collin, do you agree with this picture then that we've been talking about, that maybe, some of this is about fish, some of this is about oil and gas deposits, but really this is for China about trying to push the US out of its influence in this maritime region.
I definitely agree with what Olivia and Bill had just shared earlier, but allow me to just build on the points a little bit more. Now, it forms part of the bigger question about why China will poke the Philippines but not the other Southeast Asian parties. For example, Vietnam has been engaging its own build-up, and there were no evidence to show that China was disrupting what the Vietnamese were doing. For example, Vietnam was engaging its own island building program even till now. So the way I see it is part of the bigger game. Why the Philippines is pretty easy picking for China. One reason being that since the 1990s, the Philippines has shown itself to be a relatively weak target. We saw the case of Mischief Reef that happened, and then after that, 2012, Scarborough Shoal, and then now we're looking at the more recent issues surrounding Second Thomas Shoal. And of course, the time when Duterte was president did not help matters either. So he sort of showed that Philippines was weak. However, the bigger game that appears not just about sovereignty or rights in the South China Sea, but the Philippines stood out because if you are able to undermine the Philippines, you show and you signal to the rest that the US is just not a reliable partner that you want to work with. And in a way, it undermines the US standing in the regional architecture. In this case, it also could serve as a deterrent impact on the other Southeast Asian parties in the South China Sea and sort of whip them in line. If you are able to, sort of undermine the Philippines, which is, a US treaty ally, then the assumption is that the other Southeast Asian countries will recalibrate, and decide that, it's pointless to fight against China, and they will have to back down as well.
Bill, it sounds from this as if China's strategy is working.
Well, if they've persuaded or convinced the other Southeast Asians to be quiet, as Collin was saying.
Largely silence was his phrase.
Largely silent, yeah. I think there's a tendency in some Southeast Asian countries to think that maybe the Philippines has pushed it too far, and that they've, by moving too close to the Americans, that they've kind of brought this upon themselves. I think that would be their sort of slightly lofty position, that if the Philippines hadn't been confrontational, then this wouldn't have happened. And I think that's sort of maybe affecting their reason to be silent. But that obviously doesn't really appreciate where the Philippines sits in itself. I mean, it is trying to develop natural gas resources in the South China Sea in the same sort of area as the Second Thomas Shoal. It went to an international arbitration tribunal, which ruled in 2016 and said, yes, the Philippines has the right to those resources. And that's been the other thing that's been going on here, is that China has been absolutely determined not to see that drilling go ahead, not to see that ruling implemented. So the Philippines thinks that it has international law on its side. It thinks that China has no claim to this reef, and that the Philippines has the rights to all the resources in the sea around it. So that's how they look at it. It's interesting that two other Southeast Asian countries, Indonesia and Malaysia, have carried on with their offshore oil and gas development, and China has largely left them alone. But it's clear that it's decided to make an issue of the Philippines here. I think for all the reasons that we've been talking about trying to, undermine the American alliance system in the region.
Bill, let me just ask you one thing that we've been discussing quite a bit on the podcast, the standing of international law at the moment. What does it mean? You've got China here saying, no, we don't accept that interpretation of the United Nations Convention on the Laws of the Sea, and say we're going to see it our way, meanwhile accusing the US and others of double standards and not following laws and so on. And indeed, there can be some truth on that side. But do these UN conventions really have any sway over China?
Yes and no. I mean, they do everywhere else in the world. China is happy to make use of the rights of international freedom of navigation elsewhere. For example, on 2 occasions, China has sailed warships through the English Channel between Britain and France. So it accepts that. It talks about wanting to be able to sail through the Arctic as well. I mean, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea has been, was agreed by pretty much every country in the world. China has ratified it. Obviously, everybody points out that the US hasn't, but that's more to do with domestic American politics and being able to get a 2/3 majority in the Senate. But it's basically China, as a result of decisions that were taken in the early 20th century, has found itself with this rather strange territorial claim, this U-shaped line in the South China Sea, which is somewhat ambiguous.
Just explain, if you could, the 9-dash line for our listeners.
Okay, so the 9-dash line, sometimes called the U-shaped line, is a dotted or dashed line that goes around most of the South China Sea.
Which China drew.
Which China drew. I can go on great lengths about how it came to draw it. It sits on a few mistranslations in the 1930s, and some strange ideas by Chinese geographers in the 1940s. But that being what it is, it's there.
And it basically is this, originally hand-drawn scooping line, as you said, scooping up much of the sea and saying, on a map, this is ours.
And the original meetings in 1946-47, it was intended only to claim the islands. But at that time, there was a lot of confusion about what exactly was an island and which was a reef and all that sort of stuff. In subsequently, some Chinese officials have suggested that maybe all of the sea and all of its resources within that line belong to China. But China itself as a country has never formally claimed that. But some of its behavior suggests that it might be acting on that interpretation. So the Philippines went to an international tribunal to say, we think our claims are in line with UNCLOS international law. What do you think? And the tribunal came back and said broadly, yes, we agree with you, the Philippines. China has no rights to stop this development of oil and gas resources in these areas. China can't claim rights from many of these features. And China has absolutely refused to accept that ruling.
Collin, how much does it matter who wins the American presidential election?
Maybe in the case of the Philippines and for China, they have probably become rather agnostic about it. I mean, for China, it does appear that no matter who wins the election, the structural rivalry between China and the US is there to stay anyway, because it's a bipartisan consensus that is deeply entrenched right now in the US pertaining to how they view long-term competition with China. So it's something that very likely China has accepted as a long-term phenomenon that it has to deal with. For the Philippines, there is some quiet confidence that even with Trump being the next coming president, the US will still maintain support for the Philippines, like what it had done back then when Trump was a president before Biden.
It's a question hanging over lots of countries, including Japan and South Korea, both waiting to see whether they can expect the US to hold up its old pledges of support for them. Olivia, your take on this?
I think from the Philippines perspective, it would be a safer prospect if, a US president who is more interested in engaging with the rest of the world is elected, just for the fact that that would be a president who would be more willing to use American resources on foreign policy, to defend areas that are far away from mainland US territories.
Let me, just to pull all this together, ask the three of you about your judgment of the chances of these tensions in the South China Sea really spiking into something much worse. I'm thinking of the way the US ambassador to China said these tensions forced the two countries to talk more. And he said the last thing we want is an accident, so talking more is good. Bill, what's your take on whether this is really going to be a flashpoint?
I suppose I'm, maybe my judgment is coloured more by hope. I hope that everyone's going to see sense and hope that everyone's going to back down, and that's leading me to sort of think, well, of course, therefore they will. I mean, we're already in the territory of something unplanned, like a Philippine Marine losing a finger. That wasn't supposed to happen, and I think from the Chinese side that they have probably carefully thought out, what their escalation is going to be in terms of, what each side will do. And they will deliberately try to put the other side in a disadvantage where it won't, know what the response is likely to be, and therefore probably persuade the Philippines to err on the side of caution. And I think the other thing is that, China can think about this quite a lot, whereas from the American side, they're also thinking about Gaza. They're also thinking about Ukraine and other parts of the world. How much bandwidth is there in Washington to really think this through? The Americans have a lot of ships and forces in the region, but is President Biden going to put that much emphasis on it? I mean, if Donald Trump decides to make weakness against China an election issue, would that force Joe Biden to make a more assertive pitch in the South China Sea? Possibly. So, yeah, my overwhelming feeling is that everyone's going to be sensible about this. But then that's just assuming that present trends continue.
And that the two superpowers can see the conflagration, the catastrophe that a real war between them would be. Collin, your sense of whether this particular incident over the Philippines is going to be a flashpoint?
I understand that Philippine policy elites recently have been trying to sell the idea that the South China Sea will be a more immediate flashpoint than Taiwan. And of course, some commentaries out there were saying the same. But the way I see it is that I don't see why China will want a war in the South China Sea, given that the South China Sea itself, I just recently talked to some Chinese scholars, and there is some convergence on the point that the South China Sea isn't as important as Taiwan. And the current preparations for a long-term solution for Taiwan might be disrupted by a distraction in the South China Sea, and therefore raising the question whether China will want that. There are better ways for China to press its objectives. For example, playing what we call the long game against the Philippines over Second Thomas Shore. I mean, it just has to continue with what it's doing and one day force the Philippines into submission and negotiation. That will be China's objective for that. And there's no need to engage in a one-time military adventure. So on that point, it also means that there are some dangers that we have to contend with. First of all is assumption that no one wants a premeditated conflict in the South China Sea. But based on what we saw, we are playing with luck. And I did raise these issues every now and then, that we are playing with luck because last time it were Philippine servicemen who were injured by a water cannon attack. Now someone lost his finger, and then the question is, what's next? If someone dies, then it fits the criteria that President Marcos Jr. had laid out in the last Shangri-La dialogue that, if any lawful act leads to a death of a Filipino, whether civilian or whether he is a serviceman, it will be very close to an act of war. So even if China may not intend for that to happen, and something like that happens, then we might be sleepwalking into a potential conflict. But yet at the same time, I'm quite optimistic that China may actually try to de-escalate such a situation if it ever comes, because it doesn't want to lose sight of its bigger game and the grander prize, which is Taiwan.
It's very interesting the way you put it, that kind of cautious optimism, okay, room for an accident. And I'm really interested in the way, all sympathy to the sailor who lost his finger, but the finger has featured quite a lot in this discussion. And just as the calibration of, as you said, something getting out of control, something worse than was intended.
Right, but don't forget the War of Jenkins' Ear. That was quite a major confrontation.
All right, just really quickly, in summary, the War of Jenkins' Ear.
Briefly, it was a war between Britain and Spain in the middle of the 18th century, which started when a Spanish sailor cut off the ear of a British mariner.
Thank you, Bill. Olivia, let me give you the last word on this. Whether you think, and this really interesting point that Bill made, that it could be lack of American attention, lack of bandwidth to this place that is not top. It might be high up its list of interest, but not top of the concerns landing on the president's desk in the Oval Office, and that China might just succeed in this strategy of just trying to squeeze the US out away from its allies. What's your take on the success of that strategy?
I think this is not yet a strategy, but more like a narrative that Beijing is selling in the region, and that has received the attention from regional member states. I think the bottom line here is that, like what we have said, no country want to be fighting a war against each other. And from China's perspective, it thinks that it is extremely unlikely that the United States will get involved if it is using the kind of tactics against the Filipino boats that we are seeing. What we have to be aware is that the incident that we are discussing isn't an isolated incident. Like similar incidents have occurred, conflict between China and the Philippines around the Second Thomas Shore again and again. And it has not led to, thankfully, a confrontation between China and the US or China and the Philippines in terms of, a hot war. Now, the danger here is whether we would be, sleepwalking into a conflict because of unintended escalation. I think what would be extremely concerning is, from the Chinese perspective, if there are fatalities on the Chinese side, that would make it extremely hard not for the Chinese government to intervene extremely forcefully, because that would go directly against, the foreign policy guideline laid down by Xi Jinping on, robustly defending China's sovereignty and dignity and honor. So if there are fatalities on the Chinese side, I think that the case for him to get very coercively involved are very high. And that would mean that there is a chance of conflict, although it wasn't an intended one.
We are going to have to draw it to a close there, but thank you so much to my guests, Bill Hayton, Olivia Cheung speaking just there at the end, and Collin Koh. Do follow them all on X. Their details will be in the show notes. And thank you to Commodore Jay Tarriela for speaking to us as well. A reminder that you can find all episodes of Independent Thinking on all major podcast platforms, as well as through our social media. So please do like, follow, subscribe, leave us a review, and you can find all our work, including Bill's work and the rest of our Asia Pacific program at chathamhouse.org. Next week, we're planning a special live episode of the podcast to react to the UK election results. I was thinking, as Olivia was talking, of what it might be for a UK Foreign Secretary to, or even Prime Minister, to vow to defend the dignity and honour of the country. It might still be what foreign policy amounts to, but it does not end up being couched in quite those words. You can find all the details of that one next week on social media, and it'll be there on Twitter or X, where you can submit questions for the panel during the show. So please do that. It'll be the morning after the night before, but I'm looking forward to it, as I think, in a sense, the whole country is looking forward to the end of this unusual election campaign. So until then, goodbye from me, Bronwen Maddox. See you next week.